So in my 15 plus years of working in youth ministry, there is one factor that I have seen shaped the identity of Anglo youth all across this country: race. Just as much as neurology or biology or any other psychosocial factors that we want to contribute to shaping the self-identity in Jesus Christ of young people, so too has race in the monolithic communities where they often live, reside, and worship. Now, for some of us, that may sound like a very strong statement, but let's just take a look at the makeup of our country's racial demographic and then look at some of the examples from the broad scope of evangelical churches where many of our youth ministries reside. According to the 2010 U.S. Census Bureau, there were roughly 50 million Hispanic Americans, 40 million African Americans, 3 million Native Americans, and almost 15 million Asian Americans. In that same year, there were roughly 309 million U.S. residents in the United States. So what that translates to is that roughly 1 out of every 3 persons in the United States was classified as non-white. In a recent research, however, done by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, they discovered that 81% of evangelical churches were classified predominantly as Anglo-American. And in a recent study done by Lifeway Research in September of 2013, they discovered that there were roughly 85% of evangelical-minded pastors that confessed that their church should indeed be racially diverse. However, only 13% of those polled confessed that indeed their churches were racially diverse. What these numbers point to, or I should say what they hint to, is what I would like to suggest here. Namely, that race has become a major overarching factor shaping the lives of young people in our congregations, and that we as youth pastors and workers need to find ways in which we empower them to discover the ways that it has shaped them, and then empower them to find ways to love the so-called other with an identity that is resonant with a God who loves all people in a multiracial country. A recent example from the last place where I served highlights this. I was leading our youth leadership team on an urban walk to learn about the history of African American life in Leon County. We started at a downtown park in Tallahassee where we read historical markers, where we learned first, amongst many other things, that in the antebellum era in Tallahassee, 2/3 of Tallahassee's population were African Americans, enslaved African Americans. Then we proceeded on our walk and we read more about the protests of the early 1960s, of the bus boycott in 1960s, and the sit-ins at the counters in downtown Tallahassee that was on the verge of young African Americans trying to create fissures in the power structure and to create more civil rights and economic opportunities for African Americans in the city of Tallahassee. When we left there, we continued our walk, and we went to a historical neighborhood where we encountered a lot of historical black churches, businesses, institutions, houses, and few Anglo folks walking around. We did not discuss that experience. Instead, we got into our cars and we proceeded north to have lunch to a predominantly white section of the city where many of them lived, went to school, participated in extracurricular activities, and went to church. Over lunch, I asked them if any of them would be willing to share what they had learned from what they had read and to share some of the experiences that they gleaned as they started downtown and went northward. One of the young men agreed, one of our younger leaders. He was a freshman at one of the local area high schools, and he first spoke up and said, from when I was reading and walking, it seemed to me that over the years, that white Tallahasseans got to enjoy a lot more than black folks did in this part of the city. He went on to say, As we proceeded northward, the neighborhoods got bigger and cleaner and larger and wider. And then he said, I live in those places, and the locations that we went to today, I don't often go there because my family has the money to live and go where we choose. And I'm not kidding you, in that same moment, he said, so maybe it is true, or at least it seems so, that I've got to enjoy, because I've grown up here in this city, a lot more than other folks have simply because I'm white. Now, in that moment, I made it very clear that I neither was going to condone or condemn what he said. And I saw others around the circles that nod in subtle agreement with what he said, and I expressed to him my thanks for sharing what he had shared with me in that moment. But tomorrow we would process that experience a bit more during Sunday school as we looked at the story of Jesus' encounter with the woman from Samaria at the Samaritan well in John chapter 4, 1 through 28. So the next day during our study, we discovered that unlike Jesus' bold move to go across the racial and ethnic divide of his own day and era, to tell of God's love, redemption, and salvation, we had failed to go to the wells of our own backyard. And yet in that moment, we realized it wasn't all our fault. See, much like the social situation that existed between Jews and Samaritans in the ancient first history, we realized that there was historical forces that's keeping us apart from learning, growing from those who did not share our own skin tone. We went on to discuss that what it would mean to overcome these obstacles, to follow Jesus' example, and to reach out and love and taste of God's salvation, redemption, and unity. We stated that, it would probably be pretty difficult, but it was necessary if we wanted to recover a fullness of identity rooted in the Jesus of John chapter 4. It was necessary if we were going to possess an identity that was rooted and more in tune with the Jesus of the Jewish Messiah who reached out in love at the well. Now, of course, this could be criticized as simply one example in one location amongst one particular group of people in one part of the country littered with historical examples of whites mistreating blacks and creating racial wells that they abandoned years ago. But I have seen how this hidden whiteness has existed in so many predominantly white congregations across this nation, and how it has created barriers for young people to see that race does shape their Christian identity in profound ways. From the suburbs of Nashville and Kansas City, to the neighborhoods of Long Beach and Phoenix, to the rural areas of Quincy, Illinois, so many young people have thought it was absurd the first time I mentioned to them that they needed to go to their own wells if they wanted to recover the fullness of their identity in Christ and be able to love across the racial barriers of their own worlds. And why wouldn't they? For so many years, so many of them have swam in this sea that has kept them from understanding the ways in which race have shaped them, their neighborhoods, their schools, their businesses, the sports leagues and civic institutions and churches that often massively ignore the ways in which race shapes their identity. So as a result, many are shaped and molded every day to not think critically and faithfully about how local racial histories and dynamics shape their faith identity. Without opportunities to do this, it's as if racial injustice becomes birthed, ingrained, and then hidden into their psychological and spiritual DNA. See, in other words, many of the institutions of their lives aren't discussing these realities in constructive ways. And as a result, they are not preparing them and providing them the necessary tools to develop compassion, empathy, and care with the so-called other. As a result, what we get is they often assume that race or racism doesn't exist, simply something that only non-white youth talk about in order to get attention or to make excuses for so-called bad behavior. And they go about their days, often indifferent to how patterns of race negatively shape them and other people's lives in their communities. Now, hear me. I don't want us to assume that this is normative for everybody's experiencing youth ministry, particularly those of us who have worked for years and currently working with those in predominantly white churches. But I think, as youth workers, on the whole, if we were honest, we would agree that what I have stated here is largely true. Namely, that in the U.S., race is a massive, massive social factor shaping the faith formation of young people all across this country, including Anglo youth. And that we need to begin the process of youth leaders to find ways to help young people go to the racial wells of their own communities, to find healing in an identity that is consistent with the Jesus of John chapter 4. The beginning movements of these wells, to these wells, and around these wells, I believe are expressions of living out the incarnational message of Jesus in general and John 4 in particular. I mean, come on, y'all. Don't we spend a whole lot of time telling young people that Christ's ministry was incarnational? That it came in John chapter 4 and reached across boundaries to bring about redemption in every part of people's lives in the first century in real space and time. It was historical, we tell them. It slept, it moved, it breathed, it wept, and it crossed racial boundaries. And since it crossed racial boundaries, it continues to do so today at the wells of our own world, telling young people of God's salvation, restoration, and unity for everyone. And when it comes to the ways concrete racial history has and continues to shape young people's Christian identities, that incarnational message, I believe, must not remain silent, even if the institutions of their lives want to remain it hidden. In other words, I believe our incarnational theologies and approaches to youth ministry that focus on meeting young people on their turf, at their schools, in their homes, and in our programs, those turfs, we need to help them discover the ways that, regardless of their racial background, to go to their wells to recover the fullness of identity in Christ, to listen from the so-called other and work towards racial repair amongst divided youth. In that reality, even if we don't see it or feel it every day, isn't it enough? Isn't it enough? I mean, if that is the only thing that we are comfortable with condoning here this morning, isn't that enough? I mean, don't we claim that Christ continues to enter time and history to repair all that is broken in the lives of young people? And if race has helped to create this division and brokenness amongst youth across the landscape of the United States, shouldn't we be working on developing incarnational models and theologies of ministry that help guide them to Christ's authentic redemption in this area of their lives? Or are we going to continue to go about believing that race is not a critical factor in the conversations about what it means to analyze the ways in which we have been kept from understanding how it is of not understanding the ways our local racial realities have kept us from loving the other in our own backyard? I believe that we, with these approaches that we'll discuss a little more later in my seminar, as we will discuss more about how we move to approach these wells and to begin to understand the ways in which race has shaped Anglo youth and how we can begin the process of moving forward. I believe that those acts and approaches are movements and mimic the redemption that's evident in John chapter 4 with Jesus' encounter with the woman at the Samaritan well. I believe that we can do that. And I hope we can help them to recover that redemption and hope, and in turn follow Christ to tell others of God's love, salvation, and redemption at the wells in their own backyard. Thanks.